On the afternoon of March 5, 1931, a door opened on the 5th floor of the Herald Square Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no crowd, no announcement, no sense that history was about to intrude on an ordinary weekday. What made the moment extraordinary was how long that door had remained closed. For 24 years, no one outside had seen the woman who lived behind it. The sound that drew attention was not the door itself, but a voice, thin, strained, and unfamiliar in a corridor accustomed to silence. A hotel maid, going about her routine, heard the words clearly enough to stop her in place. "My sister is sick. Get a doctor. I think she's dying." The woman standing in the hallway scarcely resembled a guest. She was small, stooped, and painfully frail. Her spine curved forward so sharply that she seemed folded into herself. She weighed little more than 70 pounds. She was nearly deaf, and her voice carried the effort of someone who had not spoken to strangers in decades. Yet those who saw her that day noticed something unsettlingly out of place. Despite her age, 93 years old, her face was smooth, pink, almost unlined. Time had bent her body, but had somehow spared her skin. Her name, she said, was Ida Wood. Within minutes, the hotel manager was summoned. He had worked at the Herald Square Hotel for 7 years. He had never once laid eyes on the women in Suite 552. Neither had the bellboys. Neither had the maids. The occupants paid their bills in cash, slipped through a narrow opening in the door. They refused fresh linens. They declined cleaning. They asked for nothing beyond food deliveries, always the same items left outside and retrieved without conversation. Now, for the first time since 1907, the manager stepped inside. The suite told a story of long neglect and deliberate isolation. Newspapers, yellowed and Brit. Teal rose in unstable stacks along the walls. Cardboard boxes crowded every corner. Wrapping paper, string, and old containers lay where furniture should have been. Dust-coated surfaces untouched for years. The smell was heavy and unmistakable, the stale accumulation of decades without fresh air or cleaning. On the parlor couch lay the body of another elderly woman, covered with a sheet. Her name was Mary Mayfield. She had been Ida Wood's constant companion throughout the years of seclusion. A hotel physician was called. The verdict was immediate. Mary was dead. As arrangements were made to remove the body, Ida began to speak. The words came unevenly, as if loosened by the sudden intrusion of the outside world. She spoke of her husband, Benjamin Wood. She spoke of society, of prominence, of a life that sounded entirely incompatible with the room in which she stood. The men listening exchanged glances. The woman before them appeared scarcely capable of standing unaided, let alone living a life of wealth and influence. Then, almost as an afterthought, Ida mentioned that she had money in the room. Not a little money, a great deal of it. The search that followed was cautious at first, then increasingly stunned. In old boxes and battered containers, they found stock certificates, bearer bonds, and jewelry of considerable value. Each discovery deepened the sense that something profoundly unnatural was unfolding. This was not the aftermath of neglect. It was concealment. The moment that transformed curiosity into disbelief came later. Nurses attending Ida noticed a strange stiffness beneath her nightgown as she slept. Carefully, they examined the garment. Sewn into its lining was a hidden pouch, packed tightly with large denomination bills. Tens of thousands of dollars pressed flat against her body. Money she had been sleeping on for years. By nightfall, it was clear that the woman who had emerged crying for help was not simply a recluse, nor a forgotten eccentric. She was the guardian of a fortune measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, at a time when banks were collapsing and families were lining up for bread. The door that opened that afternoon did more than reveal a death. It exposed a contradiction so extreme that it demanded explanation. A woman who lived in filth while hoarding immense wealth. A former figure of society reduced to a shadow. A life sealed away not for days or months, but for nearly a quarter century. No one yet knew why Ida Wood had chosen to disappear. No one knew what she was hiding or how she had come to possess such wealth. They only knew this: whatever lay behind that door had not been abandoned. It had been protected. Once the body of Mary Mayfield was removed from Suite 552, the room was no longer merely a curiosity. It became evidence. What had first appeared to be clutter, the boxes, the stacks of paper, the bundles tucked into corners, was now approached with care. Lawyers were summoned. Hotel staff were instructed to touch nothing unless directed. Word had already begun to spread through the building that something extraordinary was unfolding behind a door no one had entered in decades. The first discoveries were modest enough to seem almost ordinary. In a battered shoebox, investigators found stock certificates, Union Pacific Railroad shares, more than 1,000 of them. In another container, bonds with face values that dwarfed the annual income of most Americans. A diamond necklace emerged from wrapping paper, its value alone exceeding what many families would earn in a lifetime. Each find made the next more unsettling. Trunks were opened, drawers were emptied, old cardboard boxes, dismissed for years as junk, revealed themselves as vaults. Gold certificates dating back to the 19th century, bearer bonds that required no identification to redeem, jewelry wrapped in newspaper and hidden beneath clothing. The room, it became clear, was not a place where wealth had decayed. It was a place where wealth had been deliberately buried. Then came the discovery that eclipsed all the others. As nurses attended to Ida Wood, they noticed that her nightgown did not fall naturally when she lay down. There was a stiffness to it, an unnatural bulk pressed against her torso. When they examined the garment more closely, they found the lining had been carefully altered. Sewn inside was a concealed pouch, heavy with cash, large bills, high denominations, notes that few banks even handled anymore. Inside that one garment alone was nearly $500,000. Ida Wood had not merely hidden her or money in the room. She had stitched it to herself. She had slept on it, guarded it with her own body. For years, perhaps decades, she had carried her fortune wherever she lay down, ensuring that even in sleep, it could not be taken from her. By the time the inventory was complete, the total exceeded $1 million in cash, securities, and jewelry. In 1931, this was an almost unimaginable sum. The country was deep in the Great Depression. Banks had failed by the thousands. Entire life savings vanished overnight. Bread lines stretched through city streets. Men who had once considered themselves secure now begged for work. And in a decaying hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan, an elderly woman had been living in near squalor while sitting on a fortune untouched by the collapse. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Ida Wood ate crackers and eggs. She cooked in a makeshift kitchen rigged in a bathroom. She refused clean linens. She lived surrounded by dirt and decay, yet she possessed enough liquid wealth to live in comfort for generations. News of the discovery spread with astonishing speed. Reporters descended on the Herald Square Hotel before the day was over. Headlines followed within hours. A recluse millionaire, a fortune hoarded in secret, an old woman who lived like a pauper while hiding treasure in her clothes. In a nation desperate for explanations, the story struck a nerve. It was baffling, infuriating, and irresistible all at once. Why would anyone live this way? Speculation filled the papers. Some suggested madness, others hinted at paranoia or an irrational fear of banks and institutions. A few framed her as a symbol of excess, hoarding wealth while others starved. But these were reactions, not answers. The facts, stark and unyielding, offered no explanation at all. What troubled investigators most was not the size of the fortune, but its form. This was not money invested in businesses or property that required upkeep or oversight. This was portable wealth, liquid wealth, wealth designed to be moved quickly and hidden easily. Ida Wood had not trusted systems. She had trusted only what she could see, touch, and conceal herself. And she had done so long before the Great Depression proved her fears justified. The public wanted a story of decline or madness, something that could be dismissed as eccentricity. But the evidence inside that room pointed in another direction. Nothing about the hoarding appeared accidental. The money was organized, distributed, concealed with care. Thais was not neglect, it was maintenance. As reporters clamored for interviews and photographers crowded the sidewalk outside the hotel, Ida Wood remained silent. She answered questions sparingly, if at all. The fortune had been exposed, but its owner offered no explanation for how it was amassed or why it had been hidden in this way. The paradox at the heart of the story now stood fully revealed. Extreme wealth paired with extreme deprivation, control paired with isolation. A woman who had withdrawn from the world without surrendering power over it. The discovery raised more questions than it answered, and somewhere behind the headlines and the outrage, one truth was becoming clear. Ida Wood had not disappeared by accident. She had taken her fortune with her and hidden it in plain sight. In the days following the discovery of the fortune, as lawyers and reporters pressed for answers, Ida Wood offered an account of her life that seemed, at first glance, to explain everything. She was not, she said, an eccentric nobody who had somehow accumulated wealth by accident. She was a woman of breeding and position, a widow of consequence. A figure once well known to New York society, Ida Wood told investigators that she had been born into privilege in the American South. Her father, she claimed, was a wealthy sugar planter from Louisiana, a man whose name carried weight and respect. Her upbringing, according to her account, had been refined and comfortable, shaped by servants, education, and social expectation. She described herself as a Southern belle who had come north as a young woman, drawn to the culture and opportunities of New York City. It was a story that fit neatly with what many already believed they knew. Ida spoke of her marriage to Benjamin Wood, a prominent newspaper publisher and former congressman. Benjamin Wood had been a powerful figure in mid-19th century New York, known for his wealth, political influence, and connections. Through him, Ida said, she had moved easily among the city's elite. She described a life filled with carriages along Fifth Avenue, dinners with influential men, and appearances at the most exclusive social events in Manhattan. She spoke of knowing politicians, publishers, and figures whose names still appeared in history books. She recalled encounters with men at the center of American public life, offered as proof that she had once belonged to a world far removed from the decaying hotel room where she now stood. Crucially, none of this sounded implausible to the people listening. Benjamin Wood had been real. His prominence was documented. His marriage to Ida Wood was a matter of public record. Society columns from decades earlier did in fact mention Mrs. Wood as a woman of elegance and distinction. Older members of New York's legal and business circles remembered her vaguely. Her composure, her beauty, her sharp mind. Her identity had not only been asserted, it had been accepted. Through her husband, Ida had been connected to one of the most powerful political families in the city. Benjamin's brother, Fernando Wood, had served multiple terms as mayor of New York and wielded enormous influence through patronage and political machinery. The Wood name carried weight in city politics, journalism, and society. To be Mrs. Benjamin Wood was to be firmly inside the circle of power. For years, Ida Wood had moved within that circle without challenge. No one demanded proof of her Southern lineage. No one asked to see plantation records or family documents. Her accent, her manners, and her confidence were enough. In a society that valued appearance and reputation over verification, Ida's story was not scrutinized. It was received. Even her later withdrawal from public life did not immediately arouse suspicion. Wealthy widows were known to retreat from society. Reclusiveness, when paired with money, was often excused as eccentricity. By the time she disappeared from view entirely, most assumed she had either died quietly or chosen privacy. Now, standing amid the wreckage of her sealed-off life, Ida Wood still clung to that narrative. When questioned about her origins, she repeated the same claims she had made for decades. When pressed for details, she offered little more. Her story had never depended on elaboration. It depended on consistency, and consistency had carried her far. To the outside world, Ida Wood was exactly who she claimed to be, a Southern-born woman of means, the widow of a powerful man, a former fixture of New York's upper class who had chosen seclusion late in life. There was nothing in the public record that openly contradicted her. Not yet. But the story she told, convincing as it sounded, rested entirely on her word and on a reputation built long ago. As the courts began to examine her estate, and as questions of inheritance and legitimacy arose, that word would no longer be enough. Before the truth could be revealed, the lie had to be fully understood, and Ida Wood's lie had been perfected over a lifetime. Long before she was known as Ida Wood, long before she moved through New York society under a borrowed name, she was someone else entirely. She was born Ellen Walsh on January 14, 1838, in the industrial town of Oldham in Lancashire, England. Oldham was not a place of elegance or opportunity. It was a mill town built around cotton factories that dominated the skyline and dictated the rhythm of daily life. The air was heavy with soot. The work was relentless. Families lived tightly packed together, their fortunes rising and falling with the demand for textiles. Ellen's parents, Thomas Walsh and Anne Crawford, were Irish immigrants. Like many Irish families of the period, they had left their homeland in search of work and stability, carrying little with them beyond necessity and resilience. Thomas was a laborer, dependent on whatever employment the mills could offer. Anne came from a modest family with roots in Dublin, where relatives had once owned a small bakery. Family stories spoke of charity during times of hardship, of bread given freely during riots and unrest. These stories mattered because they were often all that remained of dignity. There were 11 children in the Walsh household, 11 mouths to feed on wages that barely sustained survival. Poverty was not an abstract condition for Ellen Walsh. It was the defining feature of her early life. Sometime in the early 1840s, the Walsh family joined the massive wave of Irish immigration to the United States. The journey itself was brutal. Immigrant ships of the era were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Many passengers did not survive the crossing. Those who did arrived weakened, disoriented, and burdened by the knowledge that returning home was no longer an option. The Walshes settled in Massachusetts, in and around the town of Malden, just north of Boston. It was a common destination for Irish immigrants, offering a network of Catholic churches and familiar faces. But familiarity did not guarantee acceptance. Anti-Irish sentiment was widespread and open. No Irish need apply signs were common. Irish laborers were viewed as expendable, blamed for economic competition and social instability. Work was inconsistent, money was scarce. Childhood, for Ellen, was brief. By the age of 12, she entered domestic service. This was not unusual for daughters of immigrant families. Domestic work provided food, lodging, and a small wage that could be sent home. It was survival disguised as opportunity. Ellen scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, and followed the rigid routines of households that were not her own. But domestic service gave her something more valuable than wages. It gave her access. Inside the homes of middle and upper-class families, Ellen Walsh observed a world completely unlike the one she had been born into. She watched how women dressed, how they spoke, how they carried themselves. She learned the rhythms of respectability, the correct forms of address, the unspoken rules of conversation, the small gestures that signaled breeding and belonging. These were not things taught in schools or written in books. They were absorbed through proximity. Ellen was intelligent and attentive. Later observers would remark on her sharp mind and her ability to read people quickly. As a servant, she was expected to be invisible. That invisibility gave her freedom to observe without being questioned. She saw how effortlessly status operated for those born into it, and how little it had to do with merit. She also saw something else. That identity, in practice, was performative. The women she served were not fundamentally different from her. They followed rules. They played roles. They inherited assumptions that others accepted without verification. Ellen learned that accents could be softened, manners learned, confidence projected. She learned that the barriers separating her world from theirs were real, but not always enforced as rigorously as they appeared. This exposure planted an idea that would shape the rest of her life. Somewhere between adolescence and early adulthood, Ellen Walsh began to understand that the life laid out for her was narrow and unforgiving. Domestic service offered stability, but no advancement. Marriage within her community would likely mean continued poverty. She watched her mother worn down by childbirth and hardship, and she saw her future reflected back at her. At some point, she decided she would not accept it. The details of her departure from Massachusetts are sparse, preserved only in fragments of census records and later investigation. What is known is that by 1857, at the age of 19, Ellen Walsh left Massachusetts and boarded a train for New York City. She carried little with her, no inheritance, no powerful connections, no safety net. But she did not leave empty-handed. She carried with her years of observation, a practiced understanding of social behavior, and a growing conviction that identity could be constructed rather than inherited. She had studied the rules of a world she did not belong to, and she understood that those rules were enforced more by consensus than by proof. By the time Ellen Walsh arrived in New York, she had already begun to shed her old self. The poverty, the mills, the immigrant quarters of Massachusetts, those would not follow her unless she allowed them to. The reinvention that would later astonish courts and newspapers did not begin in a hotel room or a society ballroom. It began much earlier, in kitchens and parlors where a young Irish servant watched closely, learned patiently, and waited. Reinvention was possible because Ellen Walsh had spent years preparing for it, quietly, deliberately, and without witnesses. When Ellen Walsh arrived in New York City in 1857, she did not arrive with a plan in the conventional sense. She arrived with an intention. New York was the ideal place to disappear. More than 800,000 people crowded onto Manhattan Island, with thousands more arriving every month. Immigrants, laborers, merchants, clerks, criminals, and social climbers flowed through the same streets. In such a city, a young woman without family or references could vanish easily or reinvent herself completely. Ellen Walsh intended to do the latter. Her first concern was survival. She needed lodging and income, but she did not intend to remain invisible. She had spent years observing the upper middle class from the margins. She knew that access to society did not begin with wealth. It began with presentation, speech, bearing, a convincing story. So she began where she knew information could be found. Ellen collected newspapers obsessively, the Herald, the Tribune, the Times. She did not read them for politics or crime. She read the society columns. These sections mapped a different city, one defined not by streets, but by names. Who attended which ball? Who dined with whom? Which families were rising? Which were fading? Which were untouchable? She studied these columns the way an apprentice studies a trade. From them, she learned hierarchy. Old money stood above new money. New money stood above everyone else. Marriage was currency. Reputation was capital. A woman's value lay in how convincingly she could be placed within this structure. Birth mattered, but only if people believed in it. Ellen understood something critical. Most people did not verify what they were told. They accepted what fit their expectations. The first thing that had to go was her name. Ellen Walsh announced poverty and Irish origin immediately. It required explanation. It invited questions. She needed a name that suggested ease, distance, and refinement. A name that carried no obvious markers of class or ethnicity. She chose Ida Mayfield. The name was deliberate. Ida was soft and feminine, uncommon enough to feel distinctive but not strange. Mayfield evoked open land, prosperity, and permanence. It suggested inheritance without specifying details. It raised no flags. Once chosen, she practiced it until it felt natural. Names were not just labels, they were anchors. She would not hesitate when speaking it. Hesitation invited scrutiny. Next came the backstory. A name without an origin invited suspicion, but too much detail was dangerous. Ellen understood this instinctively. She constructed a past that was broad, distant, and difficult to verify. Her father, she would say, was a wealthy sugar planter from Louisiana. The South was far enough away to discourage casual inquiry. Plantation wealth was familiar enough to be accepted without proof. Her mother descended from a respectable family with European roots. The story placed her firmly among the Southern gentry, with just enough aristocratic flavor to elevate her above the ordinary. There was no Henry Mayfield, there was no plantation, none of it existed, but the story did not need to exist. It only needed to be repeated consistently. Ellen refined the details carefully. She learned when to elaborate and when to deflect. She understood that credibility did not come from answering every question. It came from answering them comfortably. She watched how women of status spoke about their families, confident, unbothered, uninterested in scrutiny. She mimicked that tone. More importantly, she understood social signaling. She adjusted her speech, smoothing away the inflections that marked her origins. She adopted the manners she had learned in domestic service: posture, eye contact, restraint. She dressed with care, never ostentatiously, never cheaply. She understood that excess attracted attention, and attention invited examination. She did not try to force her way into elite spaces. She positioned herself where she could be noticed without explanation. She listened more than she spoke. She let others project assumptions onto her, and when they did, she did not correct them. The transformation was not sudden. It was incremental. Ellen Walsh did not disappear overnight. She faded. Each day, she answered to her old name less often. Each day, she responded to her new one more naturally. Each small success reinforced the next. Each unchallenged lie made the following lie easier. What she was doing was not impulsive. It was systematic. She had identified the inputs: appearance, name, accent, confidence. She understood the process: exposure, repetition, acceptance. And she anticipated the outcome: a new identity accepted not because it was true, but because no one found it necessary to doubt it. By the time Ellen Walsh was ready to make her next move, she no longer thought of herself as reinventing anything. Reinvention implied artifice. This was construction. Ida Mayfield was not a mask she wore. She was a role she inhabited completely, engineered with care and maintained without deviation. And once she was ready, Ida Mayfield would not wait for opportunity to find her. She would choose it. Ida Mayfield did not rise by chance. Once her new identity was secure enough to withstand casual scrutiny, she turned her attention to the single factor that could accelerate everything else: access. In mid-19th century New York, wealth and influence clustered around a small number of men: politicians, publishers, financiers, figures whose names appeared repeatedly in the society columns Ida studied so carefully. She did not need all of them. She needed one, and she chose carefully. His name was Benjamin Wood. Benjamin Wood was a powerful man by any reasonable measure. He owned and published a major newspaper, had served in Congress, and moved easily within political and social circles. He was well known, well connected, and well documented. He was also older, married, and known to enjoy the company of women. Ida understood what this combination meant: influence, access, and vulnerability. Instead of waiting for a chance encounter, she acted directly. On May 28, 1857, she wrote Benjamin Wood a letter. It was an extraordinary move for a young woman in that era: bold, unguarded, and unmistakably intentional. She introduced herself as a newcomer to the city, hinted at her beauty without overstating it, and suggested, with careful phrasing, that she might be open to an agreeable intimacy if he were so inclined. The letter was a gamble. If Wood dismissed it, Ida lost nothing. If he responded, she gained a doorway into the world she had been studying from the margins. He responded. Their meeting confirmed what Ida had calculated. Benjamin Wood was intrigued. He saw before him a poised young woman who carried herself with confidence and spoke easily of her Southern background. She did not press him. She did not demand anything. She allowed him to assume control, even as she quietly directed the pace of their involvement. The affair that followed suited them both. Benjamin Wood gained a companion who made no claims on his public life and asked no uncomfortable questions. Ida gained something far more valuable than affection. she gained proximity. Through him, she entered rooms she could not have accessed alone. She was introduced as a charming acquaintance from Louisiana, a woman of good family visiting the city. The story required no correction. It aligned perfectly with expectations. Ida learned quickly how to operate within this new environment. She attended dinners, theaters, and social gatherings on Benjamin's arm. She observed powerful men in informal settings, watched how alliances formed and dissolved, and learned which appearances mattered and which could be skipped without consequence. She spoke little and listened carefully. She made herself memorable without becoming conspicuous. Visibility was critical, but only the right kind. By the early 1860s, Ida Mayfield was no longer merely present in New York society. She was noticed. Society pages described her beauty and refinement. Her afternoon carriage rides along Fifth Avenue became ritualized performances, public affirmations of her status. She had achieved legitimacy without formal endorsement, simply by appearing consistently where legitimacy was assumed. Benjamin's marriage complicated nothing. In that era, discretion protected reputations. As long as appearances were maintained, private arrangements were tolerated. Ida understood this unspoken rule and followed it precisely. She never forced the issue. She never embarrassed him. She waited. Years passed. Ida's position might have seemed precarious from the outside. She was aging in a society that valued youth. She was dependent, at least publicly, on a man whose legal wife still lived. But Ida was not improvising. She was investing time. She had built herself into Benjamin Wood's daily life, socially, emotionally, and practically. She understood his business, managed his schedule, and became a fixture rather than a diversion. When Benjamin's wife died in 1867, there was no hesitation. He married Ida. The ceremony was quiet. There was no grand announcement, but its significance was unmistakable. Ida Mayfield had become Ida Wood, legally, socially, and publicly. What had begun as a calculated introduction had culminated in formal entry into one of New York's most influential families. Marriage did not mark the end of her strategy. It marked the transition to its next phase. Ida Wood had secured legitimacy. She had secured proximity to power, and most importantly, she had done so without haste, without scandal, and without exposing the foundations of her constructed identity. Her patience had paid off. She had not married for love, nor solely for wealth. She had married for position, and position, once secured, could be leveraged. The transformation was complete. Ida Mayfield no longer needed to prove she belonged. She was now exactly where she had intended to be. Marriage gave Ida Wood legitimacy, but it did not give her security. She understood the difference immediately. Her husband, Benjamin Wood, was powerful, well-known, and increasingly unreliable. Long before their marriage, his reputation as a gambler had been well established. Cards, horse racing, speculative ventures. Benjamin treated risk not as a danger, but as entertainment. He wagered compulsively, driven by confidence that fortune would always return to him in the end. Ida watched this behavior closely. She had not spent decades escaping poverty to place her future in the hands of chance. From the moment she became Mrs. Wood, she began to separate her fate from her husband's impulses. This was not done publicly. Outwardly, the marriage appeared conventional. Privately, it was governed by terms. Ida proposed an arrangement that revealed how clearly she understood both Benjamin's weaknesses and her own leverage. He was free to gamble as he pleased. She would not interfere, scold, or demand restraint. In return, she would receive half of every dollar he won. His losses, however, would remain his alone. She would not assume his debts. She would not cover his failures. Benjamin agreed. Whether he believed he would always win or simply underestimated Ida's resolve is unclear. What mattered was the result. Every successful wager fed Ida's growing reserve of capital. Every loss eroded Benjamin's position without touching hers. Ida did not leave her share idle. She converted winnings into assets that bore her name alone. Property, securities, investments that could not be casually accessed or gambled away. When Benjamin needed money to cover debts, she loaned it to him with interest. The arrangement was legal, documented, and unemotional. Over time, the balance of power within the marriage shifted decisively. Benjamin Wood's finances deteriorated, his gambling escalated, his confidence remained intact even as his resources thinned. At one point, during a prolonged losing streak at a private card game, he wagered something that revealed the depth of his recklessness. He put his newspaper, the New York Daily News, up as collateral. He won that hand. The story became legend, but it masked the underlying truth. A man willing to risk his primary source of income on a turn of cards was not a man in control of his future. Ida recognized this long before anyone else did. By the late 1870s, Benjamin's debts had become unmanageable. In 1879, he was forced to declare bankruptcy. A substantial interest in his newspaper was sold to cover obligations, stripping him of control over the enterprise that had once made him powerful. His public reputation survived. His financial independence did not. Ida Wood's position moved in the opposite direction. Her wealth continued to grow, insulated from her husband's failures. She owned property outright. She held securities in her own name. She had built a financial structure that required no trust in institutions, no reliance on male guardianship, and no exposure to another person's recklessness. This was not accidental. Ida had learned early and thoroughly that money was not merely comfort, it was autonomy. In an era when most married women had little legal control over assets, Ida ensured that hers were untouchable. She had seen too many women ruined by dependence, widows left with nothing, wives stranded by their husbands' mistakes. She refused to join them. Benjamin, for his part, appeared resigned to the arrangement. He wrote letters to Ida after losses, apologetic and self-aware, signing them with a mixture of irony and regret. Publicly, they maintained their routines. The carriage rides continued. The appearances were made. To outsiders, they were a stable, even affectionate couple. But the center of gravity had shifted. Benjamin Wood remained the public figure, the former congressman, the newspaper publisher. Ida Wood controlled the resources. She made decisions with long horizons. She planned for outcomes beyond her husband's lifespan. She understood that marriage had given her access, but money would give her permanence. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, the arrangement had reached its logical conclusion. Benjamin's health declined. His influence waned. His wealth had largely evaporated. Ida's had not. She had entered the marriage to secure position. She remained in it to secure independence. And when Benjamin Wood died in 1900, it was Ida who emerged not as a grieving widow in need of protection, but as a woman in full control of her finances, her future, and her next move. The power dynamic was complete. Ida Wood was no longer leveraging wealth through proximity to a powerful man. She had become the power herself, quietly, legally, and beyond anyone's reach. Ida Wood's reinvention did not exist in isolation. It required reinforcement, silence, and complicity. The cost of that reinvention was not borne by her alone. It was borne by her sisters. From the earliest years of Ida's relationship with Benjamin Wood, a young girl appeared in their household. She was introduced to the world as their daughter. Her name was Emma Wood. Society accepted her without question. In an era when children born before marriage were quietly absorbed into respectable narratives, no one pressed for details. But Emma Wood was not their daughter. She was Ida's youngest sister, born Emma Walsh in 1857, the same year Ida left Massachusetts for New York. Her birth certificate, later uncovered through official records, listed her parents clearly, Thomas and Anne Walsh. There was no ambiguity in the documentation. The fiction was deliberate. Why Emma came to live with Ida remains partly obscured by time, but the circumstances point toward necessity rather than choice. Ida had left her family behind to construct a new life. A sister arriving later could not be acknowledged without exposing the entire fabrication. A daughter, however, fit seamlessly into the narrative. The lie solved a logistical problem and created a permanent one. Emma grew up inside an identity she did not choose. She lived as the daughter of Benjamin and Ida Wood, attended family gatherings, and was presented to society under a name that erased her true origins. At some point, she must have learned the truth. Whether she always knew or whether it was revealed to her later is not recorded. What is clear is that she never escaped it. Her life followed the boundaries set by Ida's reinvention. She did not marry. She did not establish an independent household. She did not create a public identity of her own. She remained within Ida's orbit, her role fixed and inescapable. To step outside it would have unraveled everything. Mary Walsh, another sister, lived under a similar constraint, though her role was less rigid. She followed Ida to New York and assumed the name Mary Mayfield. Unmarried sisters living with married couples were socially acceptable. Mary's presence raised fewer questions, but the cost was the same. She surrendered her real name and history to preserve Ida's constructed life. Together, the three women formed a closed system. Ida was the architect and authority. Emma was the permanent dependent, trapped in a filial role that denied her adulthood. Mary was the caretaker and intermediary, handling the limited contact with the outside world. Each role reinforced the others. None could change without collapse. The consequences unfolded slowly, over decades. Emma's confinement was the most severe. She aged without milestones. There were no transitions, no marriage, no children, no separate life. When Ida withdrew from society, Emma withdrew with her. When Ida sealed herself inside a hotel room in 1907, Emma followed her into isolation without protest, or at least without record of resistance. Mary remained functional longer, serving as the point of contact with hotel staff and delivery men. She paid bills, accepted food, and reassured management that everything was fine. Her role allowed the isolation to continue uninterrupted. The lie that had begun as a practical solution became a prison. Emma's health deteriorated first. Years of confinement in cramped, unsanitary conditions took their toll. In 1928, she became seriously ill. For the first time in over 20 years, Ida allowed outsiders into their rooms. Doctors intervened. Emma was removed to a hospital. She never returned. She died under the name Emma Wood, daughter of Benjamin and Ida. Even in death, the truth was withheld. Her burial records preserve the fiction completely. The identity assigned to her in infancy followed her to the grave. Mary and Ida continued alone. The sisters' lives illustrate the hidden cost of Ida's achievement. Reinvention required maintenance, and maintenance required sacrifice. Emma and Mary gave up their names, their histories, and their autonomy to support a life that was never truly theirs. The story does not record open rebellion or complaint. There are no letters, no testimonies, no attempts to escape the arrangement. Silence is all that remains. Whether that silence reflected loyalty, resignation, or fear cannot be proven. What can be proven is the outcome. Ida Wood succeeded in remaking herself completely, but the success depended on others living within the boundaries of her lie. For Emma, that boundary became permanent. For Mary, it became fatal. The reinvention held. The cost was human. The end of Ida Wood's public life did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded through a series of deliberate decisions, each one narrowing her exposure to the world outside. It began with the death of Benjamin Wood on February 21, 1900. He was 80 years old. The newspapers marked his passing with respectful obituaries, praising his career in journalism and politics while omitting the financial chaos of his later years. Ida arranged a private burial. She declined visitors. Society took note of her absence and then, as society often does, moved on. With Benjamin gone, Ida no longer had reason to maintain appearances. Within months, she sold the New York Daily News. The paper that had once anchored her husband's influence passed permanently out of the Wood family. Ida emerged from the transaction with even greater liquidity and independence. She was wealthy, unencumbered, and no longer accountable to a public role. For a time, she drifted. Ida, accompanied by Emma and Mary, moved between hotels and residences in New York City. They stayed briefly, then moved on. Nothing tied her to any single address. She avoided long-term staff, neighbors, or routines that invited familiarity. This period was not isolation yet. It was preparation. The decisive moment came in October 1907. The panic of 1907 sent shockwaves through the American financial system. Banks failed. Trust companies collapsed. Depositors flooded institutions, desperate to withdraw their savings before they vanished. The scenes in New York were chaotic. Lines stretching around blocks, police struggling to control crowds, rumors spreading faster than facts. Ida Wood did not wait. She had lived through previous financial panics and watched fortunes evaporate overnight. She trusted no institution, no banker, no promise. While others hesitated, she acted with precision. Ida went to her banks and withdrew everything. Not a portion, not what was insured, all of it. She demanded her money in cash, in large denomination bills, gold certificates, and bearer bonds, forms of wealth that required no intermediary and no faith in a system. The total exceeded $1 million. It was an extraordinary sum, and she took possession of it personally. Once the money was secured, Ida disappeared. She chose the Herald Square Hotel for reasons that reflected her priorities. It was centrally located but unremarkable. It catered to long-term guests who paid promptly and asked for little. Management valued discretion. Staff turnover ensured that familiarity never developed. It was a place where privacy could be purchased quietly. In the autumn of 1907, Ida rented adjoining rooms on the 5th floor. She paid in advance. She made her expectations clear. No maid service, no maintenance, no unsolicited visits. Food would be delivered to the door. Rent would be paid in cash. Then the door closed. At 69 years old, Ida Wood sealed herself inside those rooms with her sisters and her fortune. The city outside continued to modernize. Automobiles replaced carriages. Telephones became common. The Gilded Age faded into memory. None of it mattered to her. What mattered was control. The isolation was not framed as illness or despair. It was systematic. Ida had withdrawn from a world that no longer offered her advantage and that now posed risks she refused to tolerate. She had everything she wanted: money, privacy, and autonomy. For the next 24 years, the door remained closed. Guests came and went. Managers changed. The city transformed. Inside Suite 552, time slowed to a crawl measured only by newspapers and routine. Ida Wood, once a fixture of public life, had completed her transformation. She was no longer managing influence. She was managing exposure. The arc that began with social ascent ended in deliberate disappearance, not as a retreat, but as a final assertion of control. For 24 years, life inside Suite 552 followed a rhythm that never appeared on any clock. There were no seasons inside the Herald Square hotel room, no holidays, no visitors. The outside world reached the occupants only through narrow, controlled channels, all of them chosen deliberately by Ida Wood. Each morning began the same way. Newspapers were delivered to the door and retrieved without conversation. Ida read them methodically, page by page, as she had done for most of her adult life. Once, newspapers had been tools, maps of society, instruments of power. Now they were observation devices. Through them, she tracked wars, elections, financial collapses, and cultural shifts without participating in any of it. The world could change. She would not. Finished papers were not discarded. They were stacked, folded carefully, stored in piles that grew higher each year. Alongside them accumulated boxes, wrapping paper, string, containers, clothing, and objects whose original purpose no longer mattered. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was retained. This was not disorder. It was preservation. Food arrived daily, always the same items: crackers, eggs, bacon, coffee, evaporated milk, occasionally raw fish or cigars. Meals were prepared in a makeshift kitchen assembled in the bathroom. Cleanliness was functional at best. Comfort was irrelevant. The arrangement minimized dependence on outsiders and reduced the need for interaction. Mary handled the limited contact required to keep the system running. She accepted deliveries, paid rent in cash, and reassured staff when curiosity surfaced. Her role was containment. As long as no one entered the room, the structure held. Emma existed within the routine, but she had never been well suited to it. Years of confinement took their toll. She grew increasingly frail, her health undermined by poor conditions and lack of movement. Ida did not seek help. Intervention meant exposure. In 1928, Emma became too ill to ignore. For the first time since 1907, outsiders crossed the threshold of Suite 552. Doctors entered and were confronted with conditions that shocked them. Physical confinement, filth, and neglect accumulated over decades. Emma was removed to a hospital. The separation broke a pattern that had held for more than 20 years. Emma never returned. She died shortly thereafter, listed in official records as Emma Wood, daughter of Benjamin and Ida. The identity that had confined her in life persisted in death. Ida made no public statement. The system adjusted. Now there were two. Mary and Ida continued as before. The routines tightened. The piles grew. The money remained hidden throughout the room, tucked into boxes, trunks, and clothing. Ida knew where everything was. Organization existed entirely in her memory. Time pressed on her body even as she resisted it everywhere else. Ida aged visibly now. Her weight dropped, her spine curved, her hearing faded, yet her skin remained smooth, preserved by the petroleum jelly she applied daily, a small, almost ritualistic act of maintenance. Control extended even to the surface of her body. She slept surrounded by her wealth, sometimes with cash sewn into her garments. The fortune did not circulate. It did not grow. It did not diminish. It waited. Outside, the Great War came and went. The Roaring Twenties rose and collapsed. The stock market crashed. Banks failed again. Breadlines returned. Through it all, Ida Wood watched from behind a closed door, untouched by the chaos she had predicted decades earlier. Her isolation was often described later as madness. The evidence does not support that conclusion. Nothing inside Suite 552 suggested confusion or loss of intention. The routines were consistent. The hoarding was systematic. The concealment of money was precise. The avoidance of outsiders was absolute. This was not withdrawal caused by fear or delusion. It was isolation used as maintenance, a way to preserve wealth, secrecy, and autonomy in a world Ida no longer trusted. By the time Mary's health began to fail, Ida had outlasted nearly everyone who had known her former life. The city outside had forgotten her. The society she once navigated no longer existed. The door remained closed. Inside, time had not stopped. It had simply been contained. The moment the door opened in 1931, Ida Wood lost control of the one thing she had protected more carefully than her fortune, her narrative. With Mary Mayfield dead and Ida Wood clearly unable to manage her affairs, the courts intervened. A judge declared that her estate required formal oversight. Administrators were appointed. The sealed world Ida had maintained for nearly a quarter century was placed under legal examination. What followed was not curiosity. It was a rush. The revelation of more than $1 million in hidden wealth triggered an avalanche of claims. More than 1,000 people came forward, each asserting a connection to Ida Wood or her late husband. Some claimed descent from the Wood family. Others traced elaborate lineages to the fictional Southern planter Ida had long described as her father. A few arrived with forged documents and rehearsed stories, hoping confusion would work in their favor. The court faced a problem unlike any it had seen. There was an enormous estate, a staggering number of claimants, and at the center of it all, a woman whose identity could not be reliably established by her own testimony. Ida, now in her mid-90s, answered questions inconsistently or not at all. Sometimes she repeated the old story of Southern birth. Sometimes she said nothing. Whether this was cognitive decline or a final act of resistance could not be determined. Documentation would have to decide the matter. The task of untangling Ida Wood's past fell to a young attorney named Joseph Cox. Cox approached the case methodically. He did not begin with the claimants. He began with Ida herself. He examined every document associated with her life: marriage records, property deeds, bank accounts, correspondence. Most aligned with the identity of Ida Wood, wife of Benjamin Wood. None explained where she came from. The first significant inconsistency emerged in an unexpected place. Among Benjamin Wood's papers was a letter written years earlier to a Catholic priest. In it, Benjamin referred to Emma Wood in terms that made no sense if she were truly his daughter. Cox noted the discrepancy. If Emma was not who she had been presented as, then the foundation of the family narrative was unstable. Cox traced Emma backward through official records. Census documents listed her as Emma Wood. Hospital records did the same, but her birth certificate, located in Massachusetts archives, told a different story. It identified her as Emma Walsh, daughter of Thomas and Anne Walsh. Emma was not Ida's daughter. She was her sister. That discovery cracked the case open. Cox followed the Walsh name further. Parish records in England revealed a baptismal entry in Oldham, Lancashire. The child was named Ellen Walsh. The parents were Thomas Walsh and Anne Crawford. The dates aligned precisely with what was known of Ida Wood's age. There was no Henry Mayfield, no Louisiana plantation, no Southern aristocracy. The woman known for decades as Ida Mayfield, then Ida Wood, had been born Ellen Walsh, the daughter of Irish immigrants raised in poverty, who had reinvented herself completely. Investigators traced the Walsh family's migration from England to Massachusetts, confirming census records that placed Ellen in domestic service as a young girl. Surviving relatives were located, ordinary working-class people who had no idea their relative had become one of the wealthiest women in New York. The court proceedings that followed were decisive. Joseph Cox presented the evidence piece by piece: birth records, immigration documents, census data, and correspondence. Each document stripped away a layer of the identity Ida had constructed. The fictional heirs fell away. The elaborate genealogies collapsed. The Wood family connections led nowhere. Only the Walsh descendants remained. On the end, the court identified 10 legitimate heirs, all descendants of Thomas and Anne Walsh. Teachers, laborers, clerks, people who had lived their lives unaware that Ellen Walsh had erased herself from their history. When confronted with the findings, Ida Wood offered no response. She neither confirmed nor denied them. The lie that had sustained her for more than 70 years met something it could not withstand: records. The reckoning was complete. The identity Ida had engineered so carefully was dismantled not by scandal or confession, but by paperwork. Quiet, methodical, and final. Ida Wood died on March 12, 1932, in a private sanatorium in New York. She was 94 years old. There was no return to the hotel room where she had sealed herself away for nearly a quarter century. No final statement, no explanation. The woman who had spent a lifetime controlling access to herself left the world quietly, attended only by nurses who knew her as an elderly patient with a complicated estate. The newspapers that had once chronicled her social rise and later sensationalized her exposure printed brief notices and moved on. The Great Depression supplied no shortage of fresh tragedies. She was buried under the name Ida Wood, not Ellen Walsh, not Ida Mayfield. The name she had chosen, constructed and defended for more than 60 years, followed her into the ground. In death, as in life, she remained the person she had decided to become. The legal machinery she set in motion by refusing to clarify her origins continued after her passing. With the court's findings complete, the estate was distributed according to documentation rather than narrative. The fortune Ida had accumulated, cash, securities, property, was divided among 10 legitimate heirs, all descendants of Thomas and Anne Walsh. They were not members of high society. They were not heirs to influence or privilege. They were ordinary people, teachers, clerks, laborers, many of them struggling through the worst economic collapse in American history. For them, the inheritance was transformative. Mortgages were paid, debts erased, futures altered. The money returned to the family Ida had erased. The irony was unavoidable. Ellen Walsh had spent her entire adult life fleeing poverty, severing herself from her origins and constructing a new identity that denied the existence of the people who shared her blood. She had hoarded wealth so completely that she lived in deprivation to avoid relinquishing control. And in the end, that wealth flowed back to the very lineage she had worked so carefully to escape. There was no dramatic reversal, no poetic justice staged by fate, just a legal conclusion. How Ida Wood should be judged has never been settled, and the record does not demand that it be. She lied. That is not in dispute. She fabricated her origins, misrepresented her family, and maintained a false identity for more than 7 decades. She consigned her sisters to lives constrained by her invention. She withdrew from the world rather than risk exposure, even when that withdrawal inflicted harm. But she also accomplished something rare for a woman of her era. Born into poverty, with no inheritance, no protection, and no prospects, she refused the limits imposed on her. In a society that sorted women by ancestry and marriage, she engineered both. She studied the rules, exploited their weaknesses, and moved through spaces that were never intended to admit her. She accumulated wealth not through inheritance or patronage, but through calculation and discipline. She harmed no one financially. She stole nothing. She took advantage only of belief. The discomfort her story leaves behind comes from what it suggests. That identity, when examined closely, is often less stable than it appears. That the barriers separating classes are maintained as much by consensus as by force. That someone determined enough, observant enough, and disciplined enough can pass through them undetected. Ellen Walsh was born with nothing. Ida Wood died a millionaire. Between those two facts lies a life constructed deliberately, maintained relentlessly, and exposed only when its creator no longer had the strength to defend it. The invention outlived the woman who made it, and even stripped of its disguises, it remains impossible to fully dismiss. Ida Wood never explained herself. She left no confession, no apology, and no final defense, only records, consequences, and questions that still resist easy answers. Her life sits uncomfortably between strategy and sacrifice, control and cost. If you appreciate long-form documentaries built on verified records and primary sources rather than and consider subscribing to the channel. Each story is approached with the same care for accuracy and restraint. And if this story left you conflicted, share your perspective in the comments. Was Ida Wood a woman who mastered a rigid system, or someone who paid too high a human price for control? The evidence is there. The judgment is yours.